You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
And if you like goth talk, well, you're in the right place, because that's exactly what this is. Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions, the podcast where we feature new guests each episode to chat about the sort of socio-cultural experience of people within the goth community and review music and other fun things like that. This week, however, we're going to be revisiting our mini-series where we cover serious issues within the goth community. We've previously covered misogyny in industrial, whether or not goth is political. We've talked about the lived experience of black goths within the community. And this week, we're going to be talking about the lives of those of us who live with disabilities or a chronic illness, and how that impacts our participation within our local scenes and online. We have guests from all over the world. From the US, we've got people from the Highlands of Scotland, from Sweden, from Australia, and we're going to be sitting down with a whole breadth of experiences and insight and opinions to chat about this issue. So let's get everyone introduced. And Michelle, why don't we start with you?
All right. Well, first off, thank you for having me back again. I talked a lot about this the last time I was on the show, but I will just do the nutshell version. I was raised on classic rock, so Alice Cooper, David Bowie, kind of the alternative guys of that era. Otherwise, I grew up watching horror movies. I had a strong affinity with vampires and, the literature, all that kind of thing. When I was old enough to start choosing my own clothing style, I just really felt the gothic aesthetic just kind of rang true with me. So the music kind of came a little bit later, only because throughout high school I was trying to find my own niche and, trying to find yourself. So I went through a lot of different phases, and, hardcore punk was one of them, very like Casualties and that sort of thing. Very eclectic music tastes, but eventually it kind of came around. My style and all that evolution kind of came full circle and kind of been history ever since.
Very cool. Tanya, what about you? What was your first moment or introduction to goth?
Well, I think as a kid and a teenager, I was watching a lot of horror movies, and I got into this paganism and Wicca and stuff like that. And a lot of people who were interested in that stuff were goths. So I think that was my first introduction. But and I dressed in a lot of black and stuff like that, but I didn't really know what goth was until in my early 20s. And I had this, it was kind of a powerful experience, actually, because I never really found anywhere where I could feel that I fit in, and I didn't like much music either, so it felt like I was constantly searching for something. And then I had this ex-boyfriend who gave me a Sisters of Mercy album, and from that on, I was sold on the subculture.
Which do you remember which album it was?
It was A Slight Case of Overbombing.
Very nice. Classic.
Yeah.
Very cool. Amy, why don't you tell us a little about your introduction?
Yeah, sure. It was a little bit similar to Michelle. I was raised on 80s music by my mum. She was in high school in that time. And my dad introduced me to a lot of classic rock, particularly David Bowie. And I got into 90s alternative when I was a teenager, and from there I kind of explored what were the roots of these bands. I get very obsessive when researching anything I'm interested in. And when all of these bands, these are bands like the Chili Peppers and Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins, talking about their influences, a lot of them were these post-punk bands that my family friends had mentioned, some of the new wave bands that my mum was into, and David Bowie. I realized I really loved that, and so I really deep dived into that. From the aesthetic point of view, I went through a lot of phases, again, like Michelle. It was, I'm just trying to remember all the phases. I had the I'm totally punk, but I actually was emo phase. And then I had like a colorful Harajuku phase that was very brief. But yeah, I think by the time I was 19, 20, I kind of dove right into like the gothic aesthetic, and it was around 2021 that I kind of got involved in the scene proper. Yeah, I grown up loving literature and particularly the classics, Victor Hugo, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters. So when I could see a group of people who were equally as geeky as myself, loving the same music and dressing up like a character from one of those novels, I kind of grabbed it with both hands and went right in.
Very nice. Sorry, I'm trying to read chat and listen at the same time. Okay, Helen, go ahead.
All right. Hi. It's my first time on the show. I'm excited. But my first introduction to the goth subculture actually happened through fashion. I leaned really heavily when I was young into emo culture, which was what was coming up in my age, and started exploring the different fashion styles through that, because finding a fashion that worked for me was something I always struggled with, and that sort of led down this rabbit hole into goth fashion. And then I started searching out the people in my younger 20s, because I was like, okay, there's got to be more than just, frilly lace and studs and things. There's got to be more to this. And the first person I actually stumbled upon was Nephilim Incorruptus, and I started watching his videos and getting into what encompasses goth. And that's how I really was like, okay, I can go ahead and identify with this. I definitely fit these things. I gravitate towards darker things. Also really identified with vampires from a young age. Hey, Michelle. But yeah, so that's how I really started into it. And from the people, that's how I got into the music. And I'm still largely exploring a lot of that. So yeah, it's really good to be here.
And then Carol, why don't you go ahead?
I have two strands of how I got into the Gothic and how I got into goth. My interest in the Gothic and in Romanticism predates my interest in goth by quite a bit. I think it started in my early childhood. My extended family are quite religious, even though my immediate parents aren't, and I ended up going to the local parish church. And I lived in the middle of nowhere in a little village in rural southeast England, and our local church was this Norman church, about 1,000 years old, with the earliest phase of the architecture being Norman, and it having been rebuilt in various stages and extended, and it was this mismatch of all these different architectural styles, and it was mostly medieval Gothic and Victorian Gothic revival. And I used to be, well, no disrespect to the vicar, but I didn't find the sermons very engaging as a child. So I used to just stare at this building. I used to stare at stained glass that shone like jewels, with these beautiful windows depicting the saints surrounded by these white and gold Gothic revival windows, and these like tiny medieval windows with rich ruby glass all patterned, and the Virgin Mary. And I was in love. And the cemetery around the church, the graveyard itself, was centuries old, and there's all these headstones and overgrown and full of moss and trees growing at strange angles across it, and it was enchanting. And unfortunately, I didn't have the social skills to not mention that to my peers, which found me rapidly alienated. But I connected with this on this with the architecture, the atmosphere on a very deep level, probably a little too early on. And that got me interested in things that were Gothic in general. Later on, when I was at school and I was doing Hamlet and I was doing Greek tragedies, because I did ancient Greek for a term and did classics, and when I was going through Latin poetry and I was going through various different phases of English poetry, such as the graveyard poets, the romantics, and metaphysical poets, and it was just, this literature was something I finally connected with. I didn't really connect with other people very well, but I connected well with books. And I'd found this, and then got into Gothic literature itself, and that was it. After the Castle of Otranto and Dracula, I was sold hook, line, and sinker. And that was me on the Gothic. Again with school, I went to a religious boarding school, and it was a very conservative and restricted environment. And at the same time, I also had, how should I say, issues with authority and deep mental health problems. And I discovered what I thought was goth. I actually discovered more goth, but it was my first interaction with other people in a dark subculture. I'd seen goths before. I'd seen goths in the early 90s. I used to go into Reading, which was the nearest town of any significance near us, and Reading festivals on, and I think it was one of the years The Cure were playing or something, because I remember being very small and walking in through the town with my mother and seeing this woman in this beautiful medieval style gown with this huge backcombed hair, and I thought, I'd never seen anyone like this. It was amazing. It was beautiful. And my mother saying, don't you dare turn out like that, effectively, which I did. So, oh well. But until from between that point, I'd been led a very sheltered life for the most part, and I hadn't really met many goths. And it wasn't until I started sneaking off from boarding school and hanging out in the local mall that I discovered the two local goth shops and Gothic fashion and people who dressed in it. And as most of the people I met were, I was very socially awkward and didn't very get many conversations out of, my general exposure to anything quote unquote goth, because we are definitely talking more goth here, was people's band t-shirts. And I discovered Marilyn Manson, Evanescence, and Nightwish, which was my first foray into things that are quote unquote goth. And then when I got to doing my A-levels, and I was doing A-level music, my music teacher was, I think, getting somewhat fed up with my mis-genre categorizations of what is and isn't goth, because he'd been a punk in the 70s, from what I gather, and he knew his post-punk and he knew his 80s music a bit better than I had any clue about at all.
Well,
and
think...
so he set me this.
I do, just to interrupt, I do think it was Evanescence that wrote Bela Lugosi's Dead, so he should have been pretty happy.
I had to do this. I had to do this assignment on the origins of goth, basically to cure me of my ways. And I spent an entire weekend listening to an awful lot of Bauhaus, Joy Division, and Susie and the Banshees, and that was my introduction to actual goth music. And I'd had another one of those moments where I'd found something and I connected with it, and from that point onward I was thoroughly cured of literally, I think the cure involved being a more goth and a proper goth by that point. That was a good many years ago. I think I was about 18 then, so that would have been about 13, 14 years ago now. And I've been very deeply into all things Gothic and goth and romantic ever since. And I'm studying to be an architectural historian, so I get to thoroughly indulge my love of everything Gothic architectural and Gothic revival and neo-Gothic and pointy arches, basically.
So not jealous of you.
Fantastic. Well, thank all of you for taking the time to come on and hang out. I'm really glad to have you all here. Let's start talking about some of these topics then. And I thought starting at the beginning might be the best way to sort of get into it, sort of talking about where your understanding of either disability or a chronic illness, I'm sure the difference between those will come up at some point, how that developed, because a lot of times when you're dealing with these types of issues, the effects of the thing start happening before we understand where that's coming from. And the way that we sort of come to terms with that or emotionally engage with that also evolves over time. And so I think talking about that process and how that sort of worked for you would be a good place to start before we get into more of the goth stuff.
Oh yeah. I thought I might join in then, because I am doing, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm currently undertaking a bachelor's in disability studies, and I have a stronger understanding of disability than chronic illness. But like, for me, I understand disability on a couple of terms. You have, the diagnosable condition, which which has a usually pervasive effect on your life. That is, it really does have an effect on your day-to-day functioning. And then you have another layer to it, which is sort of the barriers that are external to you. And the lack of accessibility can exacerbate the effects of the condition. So, for example, someone who has paralysis, like lower body paralysis, they have that condition. So obviously they can't walk, they can't use their legs, but the disability would be exacerbated by not having any accessibility to wheelchairs, ramps, elevators, that sort of thing. The effects of their disability sort of worsen the less support they receive. And I kind of got to understand your disability in relation to myself because of like the struggles of my own life. I have single-sided deafness, so I'm completely deaf in my right ear, and struggled with hearing loss for most of my childhood. But on top of that, I also had undiagnosed autism spectrum disorder, and that had a profound effect because while I was not being diagnosed, I was struggling really badly through school, through socializing, through pretty much, any day-to-day thing, executive functioning, which is, the ability to manage time, finances, keep a place clean. I really haven't acquired those skills until very recently, and I'm almost 28. I didn't get that support. And I wasn't diagnosed until I was 19, and all of that's a whole story in itself. But for my so that's sort of where I was able to develop my own understanding, and then passion for the subject of disability, because I don't want other kids to put up with the crap that I had to put up with. And it's interesting to see, in terms of the effect of support on someone who has a disability, the same as myself, because I have a younger sister who is about 8-9 years old, and she is also on the autism spectrum. And she's receiving like a whole team of support. She gets funding from the government. She has all kinds of therapies, particularly a psychologist and an occupational therapist. And my mum receives a carer's allowance, which also helps cover the costs. And to see like the amount of confidence she has, the amount of of skill that she's acquired. Now, she has the same disability, but that level of support has meant that she has been able to thrive at a much quicker pace, compared to myself, where I am still just now getting this kind of support and getting sort of my life together in terms of organization and that sort of thing.
I'm also on the autistic spectrum. I think previously it was termed Asperger's, but now it tends to be seen more as a spectrum of disorders because of the way that symptoms vary quite a bit, and functioning labels and distinctions between Asperger's and autism are now seen a bit as outdated. But when I was told, it was referred to as Asperger's. I was not diagnosed as a child. I didn't have a very easy upbringing. In fact, I don't want to go into it publicly, but I was abused emotionally, physically, and sexually as a child by different people. And that's left me with complex post-traumatic stress disorder and other issues that are mental health problems associated with that. In relation to Asperger's, some people treat them as comorbid, some people see them as more as symptoms, because the way that the neurobiology of the conditions relates is still under research. Is that I also have ADHD, dyspraxia, and sensory processing disorder. In terms of physical issues, I have, they termed it non-EDS hypermobility, which basically means my joints are overly flexible, but it's not caused by Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. In my ankles, wrists, shoulders, and fingers, which causes me joint pain and means I'm more at risk of injury than I would be if my joints were stable. I can twist my ankles and fall over fairly easily, and every now and again I have to walk around with a stick, which at least people think it's part of the goth aesthetic, and I don't get too many rude comments about it, which is useful. So I have with autism, I feel like, because I wasn't diagnosed until my mid-20s, I didn't get any support through school. From a very young age, it was clear that I had some sort of quote-unquote behavioral issues, which were always attributed to my mental health and presumed to be a consequence of my what happened to me with the abuse. So for a long time, it was very difficult for me to get anyone to look into whether or not there was an underlying condition, because I went through years of therapy and I came to deal with a lot of my trauma issues, but there was still something else, and there was still this profound disconnect between me and other human beings. And it wasn't just because of a childhood where I'd been sheltered, isn't quite the right word, but certainly cloistered away from the rest of the human race in different ways. And it wasn't just because I hadn't had a good role model or good pattern to learn social skills from. There was something else that was a problem, and I could understand that there was something very different between me and the rest of everyone I encountered. And it was very isolating, and I felt very alienated in many ways. And it wasn't until I was working at a school, where I had various sort of gopher jobs, and they had a very good autistic spectrum disorders department for the children there. And the woman who ran it herself was on the spectrum, and she suggested that I go to a local charity, which was at that point in time called Albion House in Inverness. It's now closed and reopened and has a new name, and it's now the Highland One Stop Shop, and it's elsewhere. But it's run by Autism Initiatives, and they had an NHS diagnostician there. And I went to her and said, look, I don't have a referral from a doctor or anything. Are you still willing to see me? And they went, yes. And I said, because I went through explaining why I thought I might be on the spectrum. And part of that had been that my father had found out he was on the spectrum. And so I finally got my diagnosis, and it terrified me to begin with, because for most of my life I'd thought that all my problems were psychological, and that with enough therapy I would be normal. not necessarily normal in the sense of having the same interests as others, or the same aesthetic as others, or really living the same paradigm, but at least having functioning social skills, functioning organizational skills, and having more of an emotional regulation, and these other things are symptomatic of being on the autistic spectrum. But I had to grieve for that vision. I had to grieve for that hope, because autism is a non-curable lifelong disorder, and I've had it from birth, and I will always have it. And getting used to that idea was actually very difficult. There's other things about how autism affected me being more vulnerable to abuse and other things, which I don't really want to go into. But I think that there is certainly a connection between my mental health issues, how I gained my mental health issues, and my being on the autistic spectrums. And it also means that my therapy for my mental health issues is more difficult, and that it is harder for me to find a provider who will actually help someone who is also on the autistic spectrum. I've been turned down for therapy a couple of times for that. A lack of training, especially living in a rural area.
Because I was thinking about this since the two previous speakers said that they have been diagnosed so late in life with autism, and it's actually been the same for me. I was diagnosed when I was 29, so I've lived all my life without knowing that I'm autistic or have Asperger's syndrome, which is what I was diagnosed with. So when I grew up, I was always really weird and socially awkward, and had a really hard time relating to people and to make it in social situations. So it was, when I got the diagnosis, it was really a relief to know why I had felt that way, and that it's nothing wrong with me. It's just I think and work in another way. So, and from what I heard, it's kind of common that women get diagnosed much later than men, because we are supposed to be better at melting in, I guess. So apart from autism, I have also a mental illness, bipolar disorder, that that is like you get manic periods where you have really much energy, and kind of, for me at least, it becomes really hard to focus on things, and I do too much things sometimes, like I overstrain myself, and I just become really hyperactive in those periods. And then I have these really deep depressive periods as well. But fortunately, I have got a really good medication and really good therapy for it. So it's under control, so to say. And then I have my, what I call my main illnesses are fibromyalgia and an illness called ME, which is also referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome sometimes. And these two they are physical illnesses that I have had since 2015. And what happened, or how I got them, was because I had been working as a makeup artist for like a year or a year and a half, and it was so extremely stressful. So I felt like I gradually got worn down, and then it came to a point where I got really ill, it was like a flu, or a really bad flu, and since then it didn't really leave. The symptoms didn't really leave. So, and that's usually how ME starts. So, yeah, and I don't know. The impact these illnesses have had on me is like, well, when I got them, it was like my whole future was taken from me, because fibromyalgia and ME have had a huge impact on me, since I'm no longer able to work, and I had to quit my dream job, which I really loved, just because of this. And well, it's really hard to live with constant pain and really profound fatigue that prevents me from functioning normally, and prevents me from walking more than a few 100 meters. So
I've got a couple different things making up my makeup of both mental and physical illnesses. The most recent that I'm currently unearthing with a counselor are PTSD, and then generalized anxiety disorder that's trying to border on agoraphobia, which we're trying to avoid. And a lot of my fear in those departments has to do with people and interacting face to face with people who are strangers to me. I've had the generalized anxiety disorder since I was probably 11 years old, undiagnosed, and then once I got into my junior year of high school, it was finally diagnosed along with major recurrent depression. And so they've kind of just been low humming things that I've been having to deal with since it got diagnosed, which at the time it was way worse, and then we got it under control. But through the PTSD stuff that has been happening and working through that, due to a long history of mental abuse and then also sexual abuse, it flared up and got worse because mental illnesses like to do that sometimes. Then the physical aspect that I have going on is I have systemic lupus erythematosus, commonly just called lupus, which is an autoimmune disease. So basically, my own immune system is trying to make my body not function correctly. I generally just say it's trying to eat my body. It makes a little bit light of the situation, which helps me. But I received that diagnosis back in 2015. What had happened is I had always gotten sick really easily, and there were some other health issues that we just never really pieced together as being part of one bigger thing. But I went camping in the desert and had quite a bit of sun exposure. And when I came back, I noticed that I was having body pain, and I didn't think anything of it because I was like, we went rock mining. That was a thing. Your body's going to be sore. But the soreness didn't go away. And it got to the point where I was waking up in tears because my body hurt so bad and I could not move to walk 10 feet to go to the restroom from my bed. It had gotten that bad. So went to the emergency room and they ran a whole battery of blood tests. And next thing I know, I'm hooked up with a rheumatologist who is telling me that I either have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, or there's a whole host of autoimmune diseases that can cause symptoms like what I had. It was a lot of joint swelling as well as soft tissue swelling. And I was constantly waking up in a ton of pain. And then also it was accompanied by nausea, vomiting, all sorts of shenanigans. There's a lot that can go on with those. For a year, I had a rheumatologist who was trying to read my disease like a book and be like, okay, well, you have X, Y, and Z, and therefore you have this, and had me on a medication regimen that was not at all alleviating my symptoms, but it was making a certain marker in my blood go down. So he's like, oh, it's fine. You just need to exercise more. Oh, you just need to eat better. And after,
Of course.
yeah, right? Yeah. And it's like, you're fired. I've put up with this for a year. You have me hooked on prednisone, which is an atrocious drug that is often used to reduce inflammation in the body, reduce allergic reactions in the body, generally given over short amounts of time. And he had me on 40 milligrams every day for a year. I was tired of being 30 pounds more than I should have been. It was atrocious. I got a new doctor. He ran some different blood tests, and we came to the conclusion that it is lupus. Of course, my new doctor is now revisiting all of that because you end up cycling through doctors when you have an autoimmune disease. So I'm currently on daily doses of Plaquenil, which is actually an anti-malaria drug, but for some reason it works for autoimmune diseases. I don't know if they're quite sure why. And then I'm also on infusions of Rituxan that I get every 6 months. And that is making it so that for the most part, I can function normally. For the most part. I still have to be careful with very easily getting fatigued. I have to very, very strictly avoid the sunlight because it will cause the fatigue to be greater. It can also cause what's called a flare-up, which is where suddenly my old symptoms that I used to have before being well medicated can come back and be quite aggressive for a long time, or even just a short amount of time. So there's a lot that I have to be careful with, and it's kind of a double-edged sword of awfulness because it makes it very hard to find employment or to enjoy social interaction because there's a certain amount of time of the day that I can even be outside. And then there's that I have a very severe fear of being in environments that I'm not comfortable with or with people that I'm not comfortable with. Like, even right now, I'm shaking a little bit and I'm just online. Like, it's kind of awful. But I want to speak real quick. I know I've droned on a lot at the moment, but I want to speak real quick to what it's like getting that diagnosis because I believe that Carol, was it, who touched on how when you get that diagnosis that you have something that's not going to go away, it is like it takes a piece of your life away, a piece of your identity. Like, I can maybe be a healthy person one day. And getting the diagnosis of systemic lupus erythematosus, there is no cure. There might be one day, if stem cell research goes right, or if they figure out the genetics that play into it. There's maybes, but that's all there is maybes. And so very, very quickly, because of the amount of pain I was in, the depression that chronic illness causes, accompanied with all of that pain and that not being able to function, I very quickly became one with the fact that I'm probably just going to die, which is not at all what happened or how the outlook is. But when you're in such a dark place, when you're in so much pain, when people around you are like, oh, maybe you'll get better one day, it really doesn't help at all. And so I came to terms with that really quickly. Ever since, I've been fine. Like, I'm doing all right. I'm very much not dead, thankfully. But it's very jarring to have that piece of your life taken from you.
A lot of what you said resonated I don't really necessarily want to speak too much. I want to hear from you guys, but yeah, I think one of the things that happens when you're living with something, a chronic illness or whatever it is it kind of narrows your identity because it takes so much effort to exist in the world. If let's say you're going to work every day, just the act of going to a job takes so much energy that you kind of come home and crash. So then you're not necessarily, you know, I'm not, Daniel who is a partner and has a dog and likes to podcast and play video games. I'm Daniel who goes to work and that's about it because you don't have the energy to, clean the house, take the dog out, enjoy your hobbies and that kind of thing. And so I think it and I want to talk to sort of the goth scene in general, but it becomes really important to have a group of people around you that aren't going to say, "Hey, change your diet," or "Why don't you try yoga?" or whatever. And I think, like, if you're religious, a lot of times churches will have, or mosques or temples or wherever you are, have a really good support system. But for those of us who aren't, it can become really isolating to try and retain some sense of identity. So I don't want to go on too long. Michelle, did you want to go ahead and share?
If I had $1 for every time someone said do yoga, um, everything started when I was a kid. Pretty much suffered from depression from then on. So at the time I was a kid, the depression also led to body issues and body dysmorphic issues and that sort of thing. So as far as everything mentally, it's been depression since I was a kid. Anxiety kind of grew stronger and stronger since then. Panic attacks. And then an event happened when I turned 20 that I won't go into public about, but it caused PTSD for me as well. As far as physical stuff, since I was a kid, it started off with TMJ. And at the time they thought, well, maybe it's growing pain, or, it's one of those things where if you just take ibuprofen for a week, you'll get better. Unfortunately, I still have it to this day. It never went away, and I had to go to a specialist for it, where the only specialist I found was one up in Wisconsin. So it's a 2-hour drive one way. So yeah, he was 2 hours away, and I finally got something fitted for me called a mouth guard, and I have to use that reportedly 19 plus hours a day. So that can affect my speech, of course. So that can affect, going to work and all that kind of stuff. When I was in junior high or high school, my lower back started hurting really, really bad. So we were thinking of taking me to a chiropractor because at the time my sister worked for one. She was a receptionist, and figured, yeah, why not? We get the discount with the family and everything. So I went there, and the guy took x-rays and said, yeah, you're crooked, but I can, snap this and snap that and you'll be fine. So on top of that, I also had severe chronic neck pains. So it was my lower back and my neck. So he would, crack this and crack that. And at that point, I would leave that office every day completely sick, and I never understood why. So I only saw him for maybe 2 months worth, a few visits here and there over the course of the 2 months. And every single time I left, I would be horribly sick and nauseous, and it was just awful. So there was a point in high school where I was taking extra strength Excedrin on a daily basis, regardless if I was in pain or not, because if I didn't, I would get some sort of probably withdrawal symptom, the sickness would come back, and it was just awful. So after my family saying they're worried about you getting addicted to it or whatever, so I kind of weaned myself off. And the weird thing is, it kind of slowly got better by my early 20s, but then that's when other issues started coming up. So I had, hip pain on both sides, which would coincide with my lower back. My neck pain was still there. My jaw pain was still there. So it would just kind of move around and take turns, and this one would affect that one, and all that kind of stuff. Through the course of my 20s, I've been trying to figure out what exactly was going on. So I've had a few MRIs done, numerous X-rays done. I've had physical therapy twice my lower back, and the second time I came out worse, and that's when I started using a cane. So finally, in about 2017, my GP, my regular doctor, said, I think you have fibromyalgia. So that's when I started seeing a rheumatologist. And the thing about fibromyalgia is that it's really, really hard to diagnose. And it's in its infancy stage. So, I mean, it was discovered, let's say, in the 70s or somewhere around there. And so they're still debating, is this real? Is this not? So it's hard to find a doctor that even believes that it's real. So I've had one or two doctors not believe me, and then I have a couple that do believe me. So it can get very, very frustrating, very hard to diagnose. So my rheumatologist hasn't 100% said what has been going on, but it does look like fibromyalgia, at least for now. Just the numerous tests were done, and I had a double facet injection in my lower back as well to help with the pain. And that was the most painful thing I think I've done, because I haven't had any surgeries. Everything that's wrong with me is non-surgical. So it's just a lot of just pain management. So when I had the injections done, they said, yeah, you'll be sore for a couple days, but you'll be able to go back to work, this Monday. And that was not true at all for me. I had a lot of walking issues for about a week after the injection. And, it was hard to walk up and down the stairs. It was hard to do anything. So fibromyalgia in general just has a lot of many, many different issues. And it ranges from all over muscular pain, all over joint pain, tendon pain, nerve pain, and all that kind of stuff. So I am on medications for nerve pain, muscle relaxants. I am seeing my rheumatologist as well as a therapist for my mental issues. Like I said, I do suffer from depression, anxiety with panic disorder, ADHD, and PTSD. So it's kind of a tug and pull with the whole healing process, because, one thing kind of infects another thing. So, depression can bring on this, chronic pain can bring on the depression. And so it goes back and forth. But overall, fibromyalgia is just an overbody, all over body kind of pain sensation in kind of different ways, especially with the soft tissues in the body. Chronic fatigue is also one of my major symptoms. So even though I get, my 8 hours a night, I still have to take a nap every single day. So, I mean, that can get frustrating. You have to cancel on plans a lot, just because of feeling nauseous or feeling super tired or being in pain. Like I said, do have mobility issues sometimes, so I will use a cane when I need to, or I have a back brace that I need to use it sometimes too. So, like the other girls were saying, there's no cure for it. It's just something that I'm going to have to deal with the rest of my life. So in 2017, when I was first diagnosed with it, it was one of those moments where I finally had a name to a face, but now where do I go with this? It's great to know what it is, but at the same time, like I said, there's no cure for it. So it's not surgical. There's not many treatments you can do. It's just managing of pain. So no, it's just a day-to-day kind of battle.
Okay, so I do want to talk a little about the goth scene here, if you guys don't mind, and just sort of the. Let's see if we can kind of roll these two questions into one and talk about your experience in the goth scene with other abled people. What kind of, if that's been positive, if there have been comments or things people have done that maybe we can help other people avoid doing.
I think the biggest, well, there's two issues I have. The one I can probably explain the easiest will be the sensory processing issues, and a little bit about the dyspraxia, but mostly about sensory processing and how that, because that's something that's easy for me to quantify. A lot of goth is a music-based subculture, and a lot of the ways that people engage with that is clubbing and gigs. And sensory processing disorder is a double-edged sword when it comes to enjoying or finding those experiences hellish, depending on various factors. Sensory processing disorder means that while my senses, my ears and my eyes and sense of touch and proprioception, etc., all work, my brain doesn't integrate and filter them very well. In ordinary situations like supermarkets, train stations, where there's a lot of noise, a lot of movement, a lot of bright lights, I can become very overwhelmed. It can trigger a meltdown, which is basically a psychological reaction to excess sensory input. I can become very distraught. I can become very panicky. I can even, if someone touches me and whatever, combine that with having PTSD and hypervigilance means I can lash out, which is not a good thing. So that can happen in ordinary situations, which can be quite overwhelming. Now, if you think of a club, there are a lot of things in a club which are meant to be sensory. To a neurotypical person, I think it's probably meant to be quite enjoyable. The lighting, I love how actually I like goth clubs more than your typical club because they tend to have darker light. They don't have to have bright lights. They don't have to have, well, some of them have strobes. Ones I tend to go to don't tend to have so much strobing. Lots of UV lights and lots of smoke effects. So it's actually quite dark, which is brilliant for me. I am currently sitting in the dark because one of the biggest triggers I have with sensory processing is too many bright lights, too many bright colours, too much visual information at once. So actually, in many respects, goth clubbing can be quite good. And then they turn the strobe on, and that can trigger a vestibular migraine, which is not a pleasant experience. Loudness is a double-edged sword. In some respects, the sound can become so overwhelming that it's an ocean trying to crush me, or it can mean that I can completely lose myself in that sound, and I am completely transported away from normal reality, and it's some sort of synesthetic drug trip almost. It can be absolutely amazing, but it can also be absolutely hellish. It doesn't even mean whether the music's nice or not. A lot of it's more to do with speaker quality, whether there's like lots of distortion things gunking up the sound, with lots of people talking or shouting over it. The more muddy a sound is, the more it tends to crush me. So train stations where there's lots of people talking, there's very loud trains. Trains are loud, very loud. I love going on trains. I don't like in trains because confined space makes the sound worse. Okay, I am going on a tangent. That's another one of my problems, which we can get to it later. But the more muddier sounds, there's no way on earth I can hold a conversation in a nightclub. It's not just I can't necessarily hear people over the sound. So even if I could hear them over the sound, it's just going to be noise. It's not something I can distinguish. Same goes for crowded cafes, restaurants, anywhere lots of people congregate. I cannot differentiate all the different voices that are going on at once. So it just becomes noise. So that can be an issue with socializing in a club. Dyspraxia means I dance like everyone's drunk uncle. I have terrible dance skills. I am the worst at dancing. And I am. I'm aware that I can't dance. I dance anyway. Thankfully, one of the benefits of my particular set of autistic spectrum conditions is that I don't give a shit what other people think. So if people are horrible about me because of my dancing, I don't care. I'm enjoying myself. I am happy. But it does mean that some people can be a bit unpleasant in their comments regarding to it. And the other thing is, it does mean I have a tendency to bump into other dancers, which is more of a problem. I don't want to hurt people. I don't want to accidentally flail my arms at the person standing behind me. The first time I went to one of the local goth clubs, I was going to Alternative X, and first time I'd been to Alternative X, I was this completely new person in the club, and I made my debut by smacking a pint glass out of the DJ's girlfriend's hands by flailing to Comedy Christ. Because that was our local alternative club. It was mixed night. So there was that. And there are other sensory things that, people have other sensory things. Like some people will not be able to take the sort of weird smell that can come with dry ice and smoke machines. I mean, it's CO2. It, to me, doesn't smell of anything, but to some people it doesn't. I have the opposite problem. I can't smell things. So incense is a waste on me. It looks pretty. I can't properly smell it. I'm a terrible goth. I have the incense for effect. Don't worry, it's still there. There's a censer swinging high above my head. It just smells vaguely spicy to me. I can't tell what it is. It just smells approximately nice, which will do. But there's some ways that goth actually makes it a lot easier for me to cope with some of my sensory issues. I can wear lace gloves, which means I don't have to touch things, which is great because I can. One of the things that can overstimulate me, or I can find I have quite a reaction to, are certain textures, like anything wet or slimy. Most people don't like those things. I really don't like those things. It's more of has more of an impact on me. It's like a lot of the things that would bother me would bother a neurotypical person. It bothers me more. Sometimes quite a bit more. I think the other people in the group who have autistic spectrum disorders will empathise with that. And some of the things that help with goth is textiles. I can wear lace gloves, I can wear fingerless gloves, I can wear anything that distances me from having to actually touch things, and I can choose what textures I wear. I can wear positive stims. A stim, to someone who's not on the spectrum, is something as either a stimulatory activity such as a repetitive movement, or touching something, or handling something that provides a positive sensory input. So for me, one of the things that I find positive sensory input, something I can focus on to help deal with, like to help segregate my mind myself from other external sensory inputs that could be quite negative, or to help me cope with emotions, are velvet and ribbons. So if I wear things with ribbons, I can just fiddle with ribbons. And I find that's something I can use to help calm myself that I'm wearing. And it fits in very well with the gothic aesthetic. It doesn't fit in so well with a more mainstream aesthetic, but I've never really been into a mainstream aesthetic, so it's not something I've had to have a problem with other things. It's part of the reason I think I gravitate towards the romantic goth aesthetic is the textures involved. I can sort of wear lots of velvet, I can wear lots of ribbon, I can wear lots of lace. Because my awareness of sensory things in many ways is heightened, in sense and scent aside, I think I get a richer experience of positive sensory input. I think it's helped me as an artist. I think it's helped me in my attempts at musicianship, although that's more sort of neo-folk, dark folk type thing. I'm trying to stay away from neo-folk as a term because I know there's quite a few bands who are associated with politics I disagree with, but that's a whole other debate, rather than a goth project. But there are things like that where I think the sensory issues are positive with goth. It also meant that when I was given that assignment to research the origins of goth, the obsessive tendencies meant that I could spend literally 48 hours with minimal sleep in that period, listening to the large majority of the back catalogues of the main goth bands. It's that kind of, there are benefits, but there are certainly, I think I have synesthesia, which means that my perception of senses can be combined. In my specific case, sounds have colours and textures visually to me. I see different sounds as glassy or gaseous or luminous. They tend to have quite a sort of transparent qualities in various different ways, and so I also get very strong visual imagery when I'm listening to things, which definitely a benefit to appreciating whatever genre of music you're into. In my case, that happens to be industrial, goth, dark folk / near folk, what you call it, and classical music. But I guess to people with autistic spectrum disorders who are into other genres of music, that would be whatever they're into. But I certainly think that sort of thing's an advantage.
Yeah, that actually is wow, Carol, you've actually really summed up very well what it's like being on the autistic spectrum and being in the goth scene, because a lot of what you were describing I can easily relate to. The Velvet especially, I'm like, holy crap, I thought, like, yeah, I get that too. I love Velvet. It is the best thing. So anytime I go out and buy swathes of Velvet, my family just like slaps their hands on their foreheads, and they're just like, oh my god, more Velvet. And I'm like, there's no such thing as too much Velvet, seriously.
Not indeed.
Exactly, yeah. And for me, I found there's been an added benefit for myself on top of all the like the sensory stuff of the club environment is very sensory friendly for someone like myself. Now, I know some may not be able to handle, say, smoke machines, and that smoke machines can actually present a barrier for those who have mobility issues, because it can decrease their visibility. And when you have mobility issues, you have to have higher visibility so that, you know, you're obviously not going to hurt yourself or others. But for myself personally, like that, you know, helps. It makes me feel blanketed, and which is really nice. But for me, the big thing for me has actually been very positive for my mental health, because my ASD really affected my social connections, and it's quite a distinctiveness with girls on the spectrum more than boys. I mean, boys do too, but they found this more with those who are you know, young girls and women, that a lot of us, we try a lot harder to join in socially, but there's still the barriers because of our ASD. You know, it affects our ability to communicate with neurotypicals and all that. And I mean, all the kids around me, again, it wasn't known that I was on the spectrum. Apparently in the 90s, girls didn't have autism or Asperger's syndrome, but
I had
yeah,
that exact same thing told to me. I was told you can't possibly be on the spectrum, you're a girl.
Yes, exactly. And but for me, so when I was in school, it was, oh, she's so weird. And in primary school, you know, from like particularly from the 4th grade to the 6th grade, I was like bullied, absolutely bullied. My mental health deteriorated in my time there, and I, for the longest time, felt like I am no one is ever going to accept me. Like the person that I am, because I am so quote unquote weird, is never going to be accepted. And that that still has had some effect to this day, where I am, you know, having to learn to love myself, love who I am. And I think a huge help in that direction has been being a part of the goth scene, because it's like, hey, yeah, everyone in school thought you're a weirdo. Yeah, they did to me too. And hey, you like all this obscure literature and poetry, and you're obsessed with history and will not shut the hell up about it. Guess what? Same here. You love obscure genres of music, and here, have some more obscure genres of music. So there's like all these connections where you can, you know, just again, like you can just come as who you are. And I think it's no coincidence that quite a few of my friends in the scene also happen to be on the spectrum, or have ADHD. We do have a couple of people who have chronic illness, physical chronic illness as well. So even though they're not really part of the clubs and that, they're still part of the scene because we stay connected online. I know at least one person. I don't know how long ago she's still doing it, but would make online content. So there is always something there for you, even if you're not someone who's into the clubs. There's we have a few meetups, we have gigs, we have markets, or we again have purely online. But I think that's the thing. There is that very non-judgmental space. I think I think something that's very crucial as well. I think there has been a little sort of slip ups along the way, where you have in the goth scene, and I know that so many goth scenes in so many cities have this problem. Or anyone that has large groups of vulnerable people congregating, there have been issues with people who are predatory. And, without going into too much detail, I've unfortunately had a run-in with certain individuals who were, predatory. But and I think that's where it's like really important for the goth scene in any city to be vigilant of that. I do feel that in my city that has happened quite recently. There've been slip-ups along the way, but there's been more vigilance, where a lot of the spaces where we congregate are very strictly monitored. That there are individuals that they will say, look, if you are causing problems to our most vulnerable members, you will have to be removed from these spaces. This has been particularly for, even if it's not those of us on the spectrum, although, it is some of us, it's also been people with mental illness, or another disability that, have had unfortunate run-ins, and that they have been, protected. It's sort of these people in mind when they've been protected. I know for my own family that has been really reassuring, because I think that was always the big fear that my family had, was that I would fall prey to predators, because being on the spectrum, you have a very trusting kind of nature. Like, you're kind of like, oh, you take things at face value, when that makes it very, unfortunately, impervious to being preyed on. But so when I did have unfortunate run-ins, the response of the community was really reassuring to my family, because they realized, well, even in that scenario, people are still looking out for her. Like, people are still looking out for each other in there. They value each other, and that has been really good. I almost feel like there's almost like an extended family dynamic to it. It's just funny anytime, like, people. I remember one time someone said to me, "Yeah, wow, the people here in in your scene, they really look out for you." I was like, "Oh, really?" And yeah, apparently so. They really look out for those they feel, this person's quite vulnerable. We need to really make sure they're okay. And it's been great, because it's the first time, the last few years in the scene have really felt like the first time in my life where I felt like, oh wow, I am completely accepted. I am, I'm not only accepted, but they even like celebrate me. They're like, oh, you're such a great person, blah, blah, blah. And I'm the kind of person, I love celebrating other people and but it feels weird when it happens to me. But I almost have to pinch myself sometimes. But yeah, it's so I think I'm like, wait, really? Wait, have you met me? Yes, we still like you. Really? Like, honestly. But yeah, I think that has been for both those who don't live with disabilities and those who do. There is a more of an egalitarian sort of viewpoint of each other in that respect. And I think because of the fact that goth does attract people who've had life experiences that were, not entirely positive, we do try and create that a more positive space. In terms of like physical accessibility, unfortunately, we do congregate mostly in old heritage buildings which don't have elevators or ramps, and which is difficult because in Sydney we are very limited in where we can congregate thanks to very arbitrary nightlife laws we have here. So yeah, there is at least one individual who has mobility issues, and I'm often having to Like those of us, we're often having to make sure that when this person goes up and down stairs that they're okay. And it's a shame because it's like, well, you know, if there were a lift, you know, how many more people with mobility issues could take part in this space? Yeah, that would be interesting to see. Yeah.
I wish to elaborate from a Scottish perspective on the thing about mobility and heritage buildings. So the best goth clubbing in Scotland is in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. Edinburgh is a beautiful city. It's so old that the foundation of its castle has lost the time. They don't actually. It's pre-castle, some sort of fortification back in the days of the Picts and beyond. It's that old a settlement. It's also built on an extinct volcano, and the land around it is very hilly. A lot of the buildings are very old, and a lot of the roads are cobbled. I don't have to use a wheelchair. I do sometimes have to walk with a cane. I do have issues with, I mentioned before, my ankles. I can't, well, I can for a short period of time with high heels, but for the most part, I am limited to flat shoes at the best of times anyway. Trying to, whether it's going on a ghost tour, whether it's going to a club, whether it's going to some of the bars and things, literally just getting around the city can be quite difficult. I live 4 hours away, so I take a train to get there in the first place, and then I have to try and negotiate the city. That can be, in many ways, it's beautiful that we have those buildings. It's a treasure, and we are incredibly lucky to have this built heritage. At the same time, it is very difficult to adapt it, and there are plenty of places around the world, I'm sure, where I've been to quite a few, where the cities and the architecture are very old and were built without disabilities being in mind. Some of them without really things like handrails being thought about as being important. So there is certainly that aspect of things, and as much as I adore architecture with all of my spooky little heart, it is somewhat irritating when you want to try and go up somewhere, but your ankles are killing you because the anterior ankle impingement is really, really sore that day, and you're trying to get up something, and you're trying to handle a cane, bags, and it's just becomes very difficult and very awkward. And I will push myself through it because, damn it, I've spent 4 hours on a train getting here. I am going to enjoy myself. But it's still frustrating.
Tanya, I'd love to hear from you and sort of what challenges or positive experiences you've had sort of dealing with your local scene or being involved with that, getting out to events and that kind of thing.
Yeah, actually, we don't have much of a scene here, or it's a really, really small scene. So there are not many clubs or goth nights or anything like that. So my interaction is mostly online, and I'll say the most difficult thing is for me to get to gigs and get to clubs, because I would have to go to another city or even another country, sometimes to see certain bands or visit certain events. So that's one of the issues I have, when it comes to like positive experiences within the goth scene. I'd say, well, it has helped me not losing my identity.
Yeah, have you found that being able to have access to goths on the internet has been a good experience? Has it been enough of a community to feel like you're connected, or are there other issues with that?
Actually, yes, it has been a really good experience because since I'm almost homebound, I'm homebound about 80% of the time. I really, because of my mobility issues and issues with the energy levels and stuff like that, I can't go out that often. So the community online has been fantastic, and I've made a lot of new friends, and yeah, and goths from other countries and even from my own country that I didn't know before. So I think the online community is a positive experience for me.
Helen, anything you want to add or mention about your experience getting connected to other goths and all of that?
Absolutely. To put it short, all of my interactions are online, pretty much. I have a couple of IRL friends who are goths who I do get to hang out with occasionally, but it's not very often. And so all of my interactions are pretty much internet based. So far, it's been really, really amazing. And I find that there are a lot of very supportive people within the subculture as a whole who understand these different walks of lives a little bit. And it's been very supportive on the whole. Of course, it's impossible to ask every single person to be compassionate and understanding. And so there have been generalized comments not directed at people with disabilities or with illnesses. Like, well, if you wanted to go to the concert bad enough, you'd try. Or,
Yep.
you know, you should be able to do this. You should be able to go out and be active in your immediate scene. I happen to have a smaller scene in my area, but I do live close by Seattle, so it exists. It's like 2 hours away, but it exists. It's just that in my own mind, I have to step back and remember they're not talking at me because they don't know my situation. And that can be difficult sometimes and sting a little bit, but at the same time, again, it's impossible for every single person to carry that compassion. Another small struggle that I have personally with the depth of my depression is I have to be very careful of what types of media I consume, how much of it, at what mental state I'm in.
Oh, yeah.
The beauty in goth is that a lot of it tends to be darker. It tends to be deep and emotionally compelling towards more sad or just feelings like that. And so if I know that I'm not doing well mentally, generally I have to steer clear a little bit, and then I'll usually fall back onto like ethereal music so that there's less words going on. I find words to be very effective of my overall emotional state. And so that's fun and tricky in and of itself. But I still feel, even with only being able to interact online for the most part, and even with having to monitor the type of media I'm consuming at certain given times, that I can be part of the conversations, the community as a whole. And I do find a lot of support in being amongst a much darker group of people. A lot of that for me comes from the fact that with this darker group of people, they're more one with the darknesses of life. And so I'm not being constantly battered by, oh, cheer up. Oh, you'll feel better. Oh, you know, they'll find a cure one day, that kind of shenanigans. Whereas, like, if I were to be around my family or sorry, my voice is getting shaky. If I were to be around like my family for extended periods of time or around quote normies, there might be that what they feel is supportiveness, but what to me is please stop trying to make me feel better about a situation that's not going to get better. Like, it's feeling very fake and not great. Like, this is my life and what I live with. With this community, I don't have to worry about that nearly as much. There's still positivity and hopefulness, but we're more focused on the things that we enjoy together, and I very much like that and appreciate it, and still feel that I can be part of the community.
Yeah, I think maybe the main problem I run into is, which isn't very common, is just people not understanding why plans need to be canceled or you don't show up at the last minute and that kind of thing. And not just, mental health, but also if you're taking a whole bucket of medications or going to different treatments, that's quite expensive. So you don't
Yeah,
always have
I meant
money
to
for
touch
that.
on that because, like, even just deciding to go to a $5 goth night that is happening downtown, that's still a big decision if you don't have a stable income of any sort. It can be very difficult to make that decision. Like, I've heard, Dan, about you having car troubles before and how it's like, how the hell am I supposed to afford that? And so choosing to interact in the scene within that way is also a decision that has to be made and really thought over.
Yeah, there's also like accessibility to travel to these things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the reason why we have a few people who have chronic illnesses who are not involved in the club scene like they used to be when they were younger, because of the fact that there's a lot of travel involved, be it public transport or car. Although if you're traveling to the city, there is no way you can drive. I mean, the traffic is just abysmal. So you'd have to catch public transport. Yeah, I live about an hour away from the main venue where we congregate, and I could not imagine being able to do that, like, with a physical limitation. I have my sensory limitations, and yeah, I have to really psych myself up. But it would be so much more difficult were it for a chronic illness.
Yeah, like, one of my favorite things to do personally is to go camping. And even if we drive a couple hours to get out into the forest, like, when we get to camp, I have to set up my bed and take a nap. Like, even just from driving. And literally, I was just sitting there the whole time. So it's like, by the time I was able to go the couple hours to Seattle to be at a venue at an event, I'd be like curled up in the corner holding my blanket up to my head, like, good night, see you when it's over. Like,
Oh yeah,
there's just no way.
Because of my condition, I am not able to drive. I am reliant on public transport and a bicycle. And I live somewhere relatively remote. I don't actually live in Inverness. I live out in the Highlands. I have to take a bus to go to Inverness or cycle. And I've been doing a lot of cycling recently. It's been doing excellent for my mental health. So cycling is good for the most part. But I can't drive. That means if I want to go to any of the larger events in Glasgow or Edinburgh, I have to take a train. Trains I find very difficult with my sensory issues and with my executive functioning. Booking trains in advance, I have to do a lot of mental prep work to be able to do a long distance journey.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Sorry, since Tanya needs to leave. Tanya, yes, thank you for coming on and taking the time. I know it's very late for you, so have a nice night.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Bye.
thanks for coming, Tanya.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you for coming.
Bye, Tanya.
Bye.
Yeah, this is one of these things where you could probably actually do 2 episodes on this and still have plenty left to say.
And still have stuff to talk about, for sure.
Oh yeah.
There are so many aspects of it that could be covered.
So multifaceted.
We've only just started getting into like how goth interacts with our disabilities. Many girls with the autistic spectrum tend to be more pro-social. I have quite the opposite. I am somewhat socially avoidant and reclusive in my tendencies, and never really had that. Well, if I ever did have that urge to socialize with other human beings, I think it was beaten out of me at an early age. So, in a literal manner,
Oh,
in a sort of
darling.
more literal manner than is sensible.
Yeah.
So I was going to say that one of the things I've been struggling with is making sure I actually do keep in social contact with other human beings and don't just scroll myself away with my large hoard of books and make that my very focused on my special interests life to the exclusion of actually being a human in a society rather than an ivory tower. And the goth community has done so much for me in by just being there, by having other people who talk to you about special interests. I struggle to make proper emotional connections with people and to talk about small talk and about how their lives are getting on. But you start me on graveyards, if you start me on the symbolism that is carved into headstones, I will be there for the next 3 hours. Talk to me about Gothic architecture, the history of castles, about my favourite poets, about why John Keats and William Morris are my heroes, and about all those other wonderful things, or about vampire lore, or anything like that. Suddenly I come alive, and I can make connections on those things. I can't necessarily make a connection with a person, but I can at least have that conversation where someone else, I get that inkling that maybe, just maybe, someone else out there likes those things as much as I do. And I spent most of my life being told that I'm obsessive, that I'm strange, that's not a healthy interest for a person your age. I got a lot of that as a child. I came home with a sheep skeleton once, and it was rapidly disposed of after and I got very upset because I'd found it in a quarry, and I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I'd gone around with a bin bag and collected every bone I could find because I'd seen them wired up in museums, and that's what I wanted to do. That was not approved of.
Oh God.
I joke all the time, but I'm semi-serious. I'm pretty sure all my family friends' bookshelves have deep scratch marks to this day down the side from all the times as a little child my parents would try and pry me away from the bookshelf when we were socializing with people. See, like, I wanted that desire to socialize with people, but so I could share my special interests. But of course, no one wanted to talk about the difference between Belle Époque and Art Nouveau and Art Deco, and why the Egyptian pharaohs were, absolutely progressive in terms of empire running. Like, I was 6. Why would they want to talk to me about that kind of thing?
I had no connection.
They're like, why are you 6 years old looking at this thing?
Exactly. It was with me.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think when I was about 6, it was dinosaurs, but then it certainly moved on to ancient Egypt. Then it got into Gothic architecture and castles, and I'm currently sitting next to some of my hemo weaponry and a treatise on the German longsword, which I'm
so jealous.
So I get into all of these sort of things that a lot of let's just say that it was a lot of the things I found interesting. It was, why is a child interested in this? I mean, to some degree, because my father's an archaeologist, they just presumed that I was into historical things because he was into historical things, and that it was some sort of mimicry or emulation of some sort. They didn't seem to get that I had a genuine interest in this. And my dad was doing something in Bristol. I think it was when he was, I can't remember what it was, something at Bristol University, but he couldn't get a sitter for me, and I was sort of about 13, 14 at the time anyway, so a bit old for a sitter, but because of my issues, I still needed supervision. And I was sitting there talking about Viking and, Viking in I'm going to put this in air quotes, but to most people I think of it as Viking, but Norse art, and about different periods in Norse art, and how you could tell, because I was wearing a torque necklace, the style of the animal heads and how their noses curled up meant that it was from one specific style, and how that there were different artifacts and stuff, and they're like, this. So the first time I came across people who actually were interested about me going on about something like this, and it wasn't that sort of. I'd started to become aware that a lot of the time when I'd been younger, people had been, that's interesting. They weren't actually meaning that. That was a patronising sort of. I'm just going to sit here and smile and nod, and I was oblivious that it was. I'm going to sit here and smile and nod because they don't care about whatever species of dinosaur I'm interested in, or why, like, the interactions between Macedonia, ancient Greece, and why Cleopatra was more of an incestuous Greek than anything else.
Yeah, it's funny, like, when I realized, talking with some of my friends in the scene, be it on the spectrum or not on the spectrum, our conversations usually consist of just mutual info dumping. It's pretty hilarious when I go through my messages. Like, anytime I scroll through the history of my messages, and it's like, okay, there's me info dumping about the latest piece of literature I've been watching, or the last episode of Poldark that I just saw. And then they're going to be info dumping me back with another obscure band I've never heard of that I'm now going to go down rabbit hole on, or some or if they're more industrially inclined, military wear. And it's I never thought that I would ever find that sort of connection with people. It's very funny because my family were trying to help me, and they said, Amy, you can't just have conversation by monologuing. And I'm like, yeah, about that.
The internet means we can.
Yes.
Sorry, Michelle, before you drop off, we should probably, we're at about 2 hours now anyway, so I actually need to go as well. I have some responsibilities to take care of. Thank all of you so much for taking the time to come on and chat and share all that information with our listeners and with me. It was really honestly a pleasure to get to hang out with you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And that is absolutely true. We will very likely do a part 2 at some point. You may have noticed, but we had a number of technical difficulties trying to get this episode recorded, and we went far beyond what we were allotted for recording time, as we had people that were in all different time zones, and I had some responsibilities to take care of. So we certainly didn't get to every issue around this topic that I wanted to. So there certainly is room for a part 2, and I think we will do that in the future. But I feel there was still a lot of value in this episode for those of us who do live with a disability and or a chronic illness. I think hearing the stories of others and their experiences can give us some comfort, give us some sense of community. And for those of us who are able-bodied, getting some perspective and some empathy around living with chronic pain or living with depression or living with mobility issues can help us to better look out for those in our community, to better take care of each other, and to learn and grow as people. And I think that's where this podcast really is doing important work. We'll be back in 2 weeks with an episode featuring the band Radio Scarlet, where it will be straight up goth talk, which is sort of what this show is, just sharing opinions, sharing views and experiences around goth music and around goth culture. If that's what you're here for, you'll get it in 2 weeks or earlier, of course, if you're on Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, if you would like to support this podcast, help keep us on the air, or get some fun bonuses like early access to episodes, a backlog of Patreon-only live streams, that kind of thing, you can head over to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions. And of course, if you don't want to join Patreon, you can't join Patreon, we very, very much appreciate you just listening to the show. If you can share this with a friend, next time you're at a club and an issue like this comes up, somebody's talking about DJing, or someone's talking about living with a disability, or somebody's talking about being a goth in a corporate job, or someone brings up Carpe Noctem magazine or stuff from the 90s. You can, if you say, hey, you know what, they did a great episode about that on Cemetery Confessions, and put it out there. That's the kind of thing that really grows the show, and that really, really matters as well. So thank you all for being here. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.